My grandmother fled the Holocaust in the early 1940s and made it to the Promised Land in Israel. And it wasn't so much of a promised land back then. It was rough, it wasn't established as a modern state yet. As a matter of fact, her brother, my great uncle, died as a 17-year-old boy in the War of Independence. And but my grandmother ended up a single mother. We don't know why, actually. We don't know who my real grandfather is in Israel. But in Israel, she had two little kids, a 3-year-old, and my mother, a brand new baby. So she put my mother up for adoption in Israel. And my mother was adopted right away into another Jewish home, but an Orthodox couple's home. And then when she was 11, shipped to America, the other promised land of the Jewish people, New York City, as they say. And then my mother ended up in the Poconos one summer as a 17-year-old girl in America and met my father, who's all of his family's from Poland, and fell in love with my dad, and she stayed in America. But I grew up wanting to go back to my mother's home country, just feeling this longing in my heart. And it wasn't until 1998 where we were on a special television show in Tel Aviv where my mother surprised her brother after being separated from her brother. They were both adopted into separate families.
Wow.
So I was on this television show in Tel Aviv in 1998 in Israel's 50th Jubilee year, seeing my mother meet her family for the first time. I'm 19 years old or so. And I knew that day I landed on the tarmac, I knew I was supposed to move back to Israel. So it took a few years, but I've been in Israel now. We moved years later, but I've been in Israel 7 years total now with my wife and our 5 children.
Wow.
On the Sea of Galilee.
Sea of Galilee, that's wonderful. Joshua Aaron joining us today, Christian musical artist, and we're talking about his life story and what God has done in his life here at NRB 2021 in Dallas, Texas. So, Joshua, as God has raised you up to be a Christian musician, a worship leader, tell me just a bit about how that piece of your life and ministry actually was cemented.
The worship aspect?
Yes.
Well, again, I have to always resort to telling my mother's story quickly. But my mother, as a non-believing Jew who didn't believe in Jesus, there wasn't anybody that can get through to her. As a Jewish people, there's one thing you don't do is become a Christian. The Crusaders came to town in Jerusalem with a sword and a cross. They were some bad dudes. Some people think they were good guys, but they murdered people who didn't. Of course, throughout history, there's beautiful Christian people, but the Jewish people remember these stories. So there's one thing you don't do is join the Cross Club, because those are the guys who killed our people. And it was really hard for, even my grandmother would have a hard time with this thing. So my mother, when she was on her journey to salvation, which she did in 1977, there was one person that cut through along the way, and it was a worship leader named Elvis Presley.
All right.
So Elvis,
okay.
My mother loved his gospel songs as a non-believing Jewish person. So I grew up listening to Elvis, and I just realized the power of music. And the day I was saved at 5 years old, I started writing these little jingles, these little melodies, and it was always about God and always about my salvation. So it just, as I got older, I always wanted to, and it wasn't until 2009 where I decided to do this album to represent us moving to Israel and sing about the songs in Hebrew and English. And then I just started growing this following. I didn't grow, it just happened. And I realized, okay, now it's time. So then I just started pouring everything into it and realized that this was actually a calling that God had for me.
And would you say this morning at the breakfast you were singing songs in English and songs in Hebrew? So How do you actually incorporate both of the languages?
Well, I love to write, but I also love when people worship. So if I'm singing in Hebrew, like this morning I sang How Great Is Our God, but in Hebrew. And then I sang Carrie Job's The Blessing, but in Hebrew.
Wow.
Because everybody would know those melodies. But really, for me, it's this cool prophetic representation that the gospel has gone to the ends of the earth and back to the language from whence it had come. Because Jesus, Yeshua, as we call him, when he was on earth, he said, "You will not see me again until you welcome me back and say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai." And he didn't say that in English. He didn't say it in Greek. He said it in Hebrew. And now that we've been scattered around the world but brought back again, now we speak the language that was dead for 2,000 years again. And I think it's really significant, prophetically, and I mean that in a literal sense, where prophecy has been fulfilled about Israel coming back and revived again. And now I want to see Israel welcome their king back, their Messiah back. And I'm trying to do that through song.